The auctioneer called her scrawny goods, and nobody made a bid. The wind, a cruel and constant resident of Dust Devil Creek, whipped strands of mousy hair across Ilara's face, but she didn't bother to push them away. Humiliation was a coat she had worn for so long it had molded to the shape of her bones. She stood on the splintered planks of the makeshift stage, a girl of 17 winters who looked closer to 12, all sharp angles and hollowed eyes. The men in the crowd, farmers and ranchers with hands like leather mallets, looked through her. They wanted a woman who could haul water and birth sons, not a slip of a thing who might be carried off by the next strong gust. From the edge of the sparse crowd, Sheriff Elias Thorne watched, his face carved from the same granite as the mountains that loomed over the town. His duty was to be here, to ensure the grim transaction was legal, a bitter pill he swallowed with the dust in his throat. He saw not a girl, but a problem he didn't want. Another piece of human flotsam washed up on the shores of his jurisdiction. He was a man who preferred the clean, simple logic of a jail cell and the quiet company of ghosts. His wife, Sarah, and his little girl, Lily, were buried on the hill behind the church, and they were more real to him than any living soul in this forsaken town. He had sealed his heart in their shed casket and thrown away the key. Finally, a coarse voice cut through the murmuring. $1. It was Silas Blackwood, a pig farmer whose cruelty was as legendary as the stench that clung to him. A ripple of distaste went through the crowd. Blackwood didn't need a farmhand, he collected broken things. The auctioneer, eager to be done, slammed his gavel. Sold, to Mr. Blackwood, for $1. Ilara's blood ran cold. She had heard the stories. She would rather face the wolves in the hills than the man waddling toward her, his grin revealing a graveyard of brown teeth. As Blackwood approached the stage, his eyes gleaming with a greasy sort of ownership, Sheriff Thorne turned to make a note in his ledger. It was in that moment, a sliver of time born of desperation and genius, that Ilara moved. She slipped off the stage, silent as a shadow, her small frame unnoticed in the dispersing crowd. She walked directly behind the sheriff, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. His focus was on the ink drying on the page, his mind already retreating to the hollow quiet of his office. Her fingers, nimble from years of mending torn clothes, were as light as a moth's wing. They brushed against the heavy leather of his gun belt, found the cool, star-shaped metal of his badge, and lifted it from its clip. It was heavy in her palm, a solid piece of authority in a life defined by powerlessness. She secreted it in the pocket of her worn dress just as Blackwood's heavy hand fell on her shoulder. "Come on, girl. Got chores for you." His grip was bruising. Ilara didn't flinch. She turned, not to Blackwood, but to the sheriff, who was now closing his ledger. She pitched her voice to carry, clear and steady despite the terror shaking her from the inside out. "Sheriff Thorne," she said loudly. A few townsfolk turned to look. Thorne looked up, his grey eyes annoyed at the interruption. Ilara held her ground. "You said to come with you when this was over." About that official matter, a stunned silence fell. Blackwood's jaw dropped. The sheriff's eyes narrowed, a storm gathering in their depths. He saw the faint outline of the missing badge on his belt. He saw the defiant terror in her eyes. He saw the entire town watching. He was trapped. To call her a liar was to admit a waif of a girl had bested him, had stolen the very symbol of his authority from under his nose. With a slow, grinding resentment, he made a choice. He fixed Blackwood with a glacial stare. "Let her go, Silas. She's with me." The walk to the sheriff's office was the longest 50 yards of Ilara's life. The building was like the man, stark, solid, and unadorned. It sat at the end of the dusty main street, a silent declaration of order against the chaos of the wilderness. He didn't speak a word, his long strides forcing her into a near run to keep up. The silence was heavier than any blow she had ever received, thick with his cold fury. Inside, the office smelled of stale coffee, oiled leather, and loneliness. A scarred wooden desk dominated the room, behind which stood a rack holding a single rifle. 2 cells, empty and clean, lined the back wall. A door to the side led to his living quarters. He shut the main door behind them, the sound echoing like a death knell. He turned, and for the first time, he truly looked at her. He wasn't seeing scrawny goods anymore. He was seeing a thief and a liar who had publicly cornered him. "The badge," he said, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't a question. Ilara reached into her pocket, her hand trembling slightly, and placed the tin star on his desk. It shone dully in the afternoon light pouring through the grimy window. He picked it up, turning it over in his calloused fingers as if to make sure it was real. He looked from the badge back to her face, searching for something, remorse, perhaps, or fear. He found only a quiet, bone-deep exhaustion. "Why?" he asked, the single word carrying the weight of his violated authority. Ilara met his gaze. "You saw the man who bought me," she replied, her own voice barely a whisper. The badge seemed safer, the simple honesty of it disarmed him. It wasn't cunning for the sake of it, it was survival. He was silent for a long time, the cogs of his rigid, ordered mind grinding against this unexpected complication. He couldn't throw her in a cell, Blackwood would have a claim. He couldn't turn her out, Blackwood would be waiting. He was the law, and this girl had used the symbol of his law to trap him in a cage of his own making. He let out a long, slow breath, a sound of profound weariness. He gestured to a small cot in the corner of the office. "You can stay there. For now. Don't touch anything. Don't speak unless you're spoken to. And you will work. You'll earn your keep until I figure out what to do with you." A silent treaty was drawn in the days that followed. Ilara scrubbed the floors of the office until the pine boards gleamed. She washed his dishes, which had been piling up by the small stove in his quarters, and organized his scattered papers into neat stacks. She mended a tear in his coat with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She did not speak. She simply worked, moving through his solitary existence with a ghostly quietness that slowly began to feel less like an intrusion and more like a presence. Elias watched her from his desk, pretending to be absorbed in his paperwork. He had expected her to be a nuisance, a constant, chattering problem. Instead, she was silence. She was industry. She was a sliver of order in the chaos of his grief. He found himself leaving an extra apple on the table in the morning, placing a thicker blanket at the foot of her cot at night. These were actions without words, a language of provision he understood better than conversation. One evening, as the sun bled out across the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, he sat cleaning his revolver, the rhythmic click and slide of metal the only sound. He caught her watching him, her hand still in a basin of soapy water. The look in her eyes wasn't fear, but a deep, unnerving sadness. It was a look he knew well, he saw it in the mirror every morning. He thought of Lily, his daughter, who would have been just a few years younger than this girl. He remembered the weight of her small hand in his, the sound of her laughter as she'd chased butterflies in the meadow behind their old homestead. The memory was a physical pain, a phantom limb that ached with a loss so profound it had hollowed him out completely. He saw Ilara's chapped hands, the weariness in the slump of her shoulders, and for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something other than his own pain. It was a faint, unfamiliar stirring of empathy, a crack in the granite facade of his heart. A week after she arrived, while sweeping the dust from the small room that served as his living quarters, Ilara found it. On the small, rickety nightstand beside his bed, half hidden beneath a stack of old wanted posters, was a small wooden bird. It was crudely carved, its wings uneven, its shape more lump than bird, but it had been sanded smooth with what was clearly great care and affection. It was the only object in the entire building that spoke of anything other than duty or necessity. She picked it up, its worn wood warm against her palm. It felt like a secret, a piece of a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving. Elias entered the room, stopping dead in the doorway. His face, usually a mask of stoicism, darkened with a raw, immediate pain. "Put that down," he said, his voice sharp and brittle. Ilara's hand flew back as if burned, and she gently placed the bird back on the nightstand. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her eyes wide. He stood there for a moment, his fists clenched at his sides, wrestling with an emotion he had long since buried. The silence stretched, taut and fragile. Finally, the tension seemed to drain out of him, leaving him looking older, more weary than ever before. "My daughter," he said, the words rusty from disuse. Lily. She carved it for me. The week before the fever took her, he didn't look at Elara as he spoke, his gaze fixed on the little bird as if it were the only thing holding him upright. The admission hung in the air between them, a confession of a wound that would never heal. Elara felt her own ghosts rise to meet his. My parents died on the trail, she said, her voice quiet but steady. Cholera. One day my father was telling me stories about the ocean, the next, he was gone. My mother followed 2 days later. I buried them myself. Elias finally looked at her, and in that shared glance, a silent understanding passed between two people who knew the language of loss. They were no longer just a sheriff and an orphan, a lawman and a thief. They were survivors, anchored together in a sea of shared grief. The town of Dust Devil Creek was a place where whispers traveled faster than horses. Silas Blackwood, cheated of his prize, began to poison the well of public opinion. He sat on the porch of the general store, spitting tobacco juice and spinning tales. He said the sheriff had taken a fancy to the orphaned girl, that he was keeping her for himself, defying the very law he was sworn to uphold. The story festered, growing uglier with each retelling. Soon, the townsfolk began to look at Elias differently. The respect he had commanded turned to suspicion. Mothers pulled their children closer when he passed. The men who had once greeted him with a nod now stared at his boots. Elara felt the change like a drop in temperature. When she went to the store for flour and coffee, the proprietor's wife served her in cold silence, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. The whispers followed her down the street, stinging her back like tiny, poisoned darts. She retreated further into the sanctuary of the sheriff's office, her world shrinking to those four walls. Elias was acutely aware of the shift. He felt the town's judgment like a physical weight. Part of him, the cold, logical part, knew the easiest solution was to send her away, to put her on a stagecoach to the next town and wash his hands of the problem. It would restore order. It would silence the gossip. But when he looked at her, sitting quietly by the fire, mending one of his shirts, he found he couldn't do it. A fierce, unfamiliar protectiveness had taken root in the barren soil of his heart. She had nowhere to go. Sending her away would be a death sentence, one way or another. He had upheld a cruel law at that auction, and his penance, it seemed, was to defy the cruel judgment of the town now. He started walking her to the store, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol, a silent warning to anyone who might get any ideas. He was drawing a line in the dust, and Elara was standing safely behind it. The inevitable confrontation came on a Tuesday. Elias had been called out to a dispute at a ranch 5 miles north of town, leaving Elara alone for the first time since her arrival. He told her to lock the door and speak to no one, and she had obeyed. But they were out of salt, and she knew he liked his stew seasoned. Believing it was safe enough in the middle of the day, she took a few coins from the jar he kept on the desk and slipped out, heading for the general store. She was halfway there when a large shadow fell over her. It was Silas Blackwood. He smelled of sour mash and something rotten. Well now, he sneered, blocking her path. Look what the cat dragged in. Thought the good sheriff was keeping you under lock and key. Elara tried to sidestep him, her heart hammering against her ribs. Excuse me, Mr. Blackwood. He moved with her, a predator toying with its prey. I paid $1 for you, girl. That makes you my property. The sheriff ain't here to protect you now. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his thick fingers digging into her flesh. You're coming with me. A scream caught in her throat. The street was empty, everyone indoors escaping the midday sun. Just as despair began to wash over her, a calm, cold voice sliced through the air. Let her go. Silas. Elias was there, standing at the end of the street, his horse behind him. He must have forgotten something, turned back. His face was unreadable, but his stance was coiled, every inch of him radiating a lethal stillness. Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. She's mine, Thorn. I paid for her. Elias didn't raise his voice. He just started walking toward them, his steps slow and deliberate. You paid for nothing, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. You bought a piece of paper. You're touching a person. Now, for the last time, let her go. Blackwood, emboldened by liquor and his own perceived rights, shoved Elara behind him. You'll have to make me, Sheriff. You and your high and mighty notions, that was all Elias needed. He didn't draw his gun. This wasn't about the law, it was about something older, more fundamental. He moved with a speed that was shocking in a man his size. He didn't throw a wild punch. His fist shot out, a hard, precise strike that connected with Blackwood's jaw with a sickening crack. The bigger man staggered back, surprise and pain warring on his face. Before he could recover, Elias was on him. It wasn't a brawl, it was a dismantling. He used Blackwood's own momentum against him, twisting his arm and forcing him to the ground. He pressed his knee into the man's back, the dust puffing up around them. He wasn't the town sheriff in that moment. He was a man defending his territory, his home. He was protecting her. He hauled Blackwood to his feet, a trickle of blood running from the farmer's split lip. You will never speak to her again, Elias said, his voice a raw whisper of controlled violence. You will never look at her again. If I see you within 10 feet of her, I will charge you with trespassing, assault, and anything else I can find in this book. Do you understand me? Blackwood, his arrogance shattered, could only manage a terrified nod. Elias shoved him away. Get out of my town, Silas. Blackwood scrambled to his feet and fled, not even daring to look back. Elias stood there for a moment, his chest heaving, before he turned to Elara. She was standing exactly where he'd left her, her eyes wide with shock and something else, something he hadn't seen before, or... He walked over to her, his face softening as he looked down at the red marks on her arm where Blackwood had grabbed her. Without a word, he gently took her hand and led her back to the office, back to safety. Back inside, the silence was different. It wasn't the tense, fragile quiet of their first days together, nor the comfortable quiet of their established routine. This silence was charged, heavy with unspoken things. The raw violence of the confrontation had stripped away their protective layers, leaving them both exposed. Elias slumped into his chair, the adrenaline leaving him, replaced by a deep, bone-weary ache. Elara retrieved the medical kit from a shelf, her movements sure and steady. She poured antiseptic onto a clean cloth and, without asking permission, began to gently clean the split knuckles on his right hand. He didn't pull away. He watched her, his gaze intense. Her touch was featherlight, a stark contrast to the brutality he had just unleashed. He had protected her, and now she was tending to him. It was a perfect, unspoken circle of care. I was wrong, he said, his voice raspy. Elara looked up, her fingers pausing their work. On the day of the auction, he clarified, his eyes finding hers. I stood there and I let it happen. I told myself it was the law. But the law isn't always right. Sometimes it's just a shield for cruelty. A man like Blackwood, he shouldn't have the right to buy another person's life for $1. The confession cost him dearly, she could see it in the tightness around his mouth. He had lived his life by a code, and he was admitting that code was flawed. He looked over at his desk, at the tin star she had stolen. He stood up, walked over, and picked it up. He polished it slowly with his sleeve, then turned back to her. He pinned it back onto his chest, the metal settling into its rightful place. This badge, he said, his voice gaining strength, is supposed to mean something. It's supposed to mean I protect the good people in this town from the bad ones. He took a step closer to her, his shadow falling over her. It means I protect you, Elara. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gesture around the small, sparse rooms that had become her world. This doesn't have to be a sanctuary you work for. It can be your home. If you'll have it. A year passed. Spring came to Dust Devil Creek, not with a sudden burst of glory, but with a quiet, stubborn persistence, much like love itself. The harsh wind softened, and tiny, resilient wildflowers pushed their way through the hard-packed earth. The changes in the town were just as subtle. The whispers about the sheriff and the orphan girl had died down, replaced by a grudging respect. They saw how he smiled now, a small, rare thing, but real. They saw how she walked beside him, no longer a frightened shadow, but a woman with a quiet, unshakable confidence. The star was still pinned to his chest, but a simple, slender gold band now circled the third finger of his left hand. A matching one graced hers. They had been married by a traveling preacher 3 months prior, a simple ceremony with the blacksmith and his wife as witnesses. The sheriff's office was still an office, but it was also a home. Geraniums bloomed in a pot on the windowsill. The scent of baking bread often mingled with the smell of oiled leather. One evening, Elias sat on the porch, watching the last light of day paint the mountains in hues of gold and rose. Elara came out and sat on the step beside him, leaning her head against his shoulder. He wrapped an arm around her, the gesture as natural as breathing. He was still Elias Thorne, sheriff of Dust Devil Creek, a man who knew loss. But he was no longer hollow. The ghosts of his past had not vanished, but they now shared their space with a living, breathing warmth. Elara was no longer the orphan nobody wanted. She was the woman who had outsmarted a sheriff, stolen his badge, and in doing so, had stolen his heart and given him back his soul. They had found in each other's lonely landscapes a place to plant roots, proving that even in the dustiest, most forgotten corners of the world, a home could be built not of wood or stone, but of courage, kindness, and a shared, silent understanding. In a world that tried to sell her for $1, she proved she was priceless. In a town that judged him for his kindness, he showed that true strength isn't in upholding a cruel law, but in protecting a good heart. Elara and Elias remind us that sometimes, you have to break the rules to fix what's broken in the world. They teach us that a home isn't a place, but a person, and that the deepest wounds can be healed by the quiet courage to love again. Their story is a testament to the fact that even after the most devastating losses, the human heart has an infinite capacity to rebuild, to find light in the darkest of places, and to discover that the person you rescue is often the one who ends up rescuing you. We celebrate their resilience and the beautiful, quiet love they built together.